Okay, we are live. I think we are live. You can never really be too sure on YouTube, but I think we are live. So, joining me today, as usual, very special guest. I'm very excited for today's discussion. So today we have Kevin O'Regan. Kevin, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you?
So I'm Kevin O'Regan. I did my bachelor's in theoretical physics, and then I started a PhD in solid state theoretical physics, but then I changed to psychology and moved to Paris, where I studied eye movements in reading. And doing that led me to become interested in understanding why we're able to see so well despite the terrible defects of our visual systems. And I then thought up a way of understanding that problem, which involved thinking in a completely different way about vision compared to what other people thought. And that led me to predict things like change blindness and, uh, and to realize that there are aspects of vision which the richness of vision is a little, could be said in some sense to be a kind of illusion. And then I realized that that same view could also apply to consciousness, to the phenomenal aspects of consciousness. So then I wrote these papers on what I call my sensory motor approach to consciousness. But I was kind of a little bit peeved to see that nobody really likes this theory. And I'd like to know why philosophers don't like this theory, which I think is just so great, since it solves the problem, the supposed hard problem of phenomenal consciousness. Uh, yeah, it
Uh-huh.
makes things so easy to understand. So that's where I am now. Now I'm retired, and I'm moving away from consciousness to uh, to looking at understanding. I'm trying to figure out why current AI doesn't really understand anything and what we have to do to improve that situation.
Uh-huh. Interesting. Okay. So there's a lot there to cover, obviously. So I will just, can I, before we get to the main point of our discussion, hopefully, ask about that transition from, because you say this in your book too, but it's in one sentence. You started off as an undergraduate doing physics and then moved to Paris to do psychology. How did that transition happen? What was it that made you give
Well, the
up?
reason I did physics actually was the only reason I did physics and solid state physics for that matter was that I really was interested in the brain. Ever since I've been very young, I've always wanted to make a machine that thinks. And I was convinced that understanding the thousands and millions of neurons in the brain as a multi-body system, like, in physics, there's this thing called the n-body problem, where they have developed statistical methods of analyzing these very large interacting systems. That's why I did solid state physics. Um, but in the lab where I wasn't kind of really approaching that, and I met a man in Paris who suggested I switch to psychology. But in fact, even then, I didn't start thinking about thinking or consciousness or anything. I worked on some, I worked on vision essentially. But that really got me in the direction I wanted to go.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So it is somewhat surprising and interesting when you see all the connections that arise early in people's careers, like the interest in physics and stuff and so on, because of being interested in the brain. So that's very cool. Um, the new way of approaching things, at least as you explain it often, is trying to make sense of what you perceive as a lot of defects in the eye. So I was wondering if you could just give us a brief overview of like what it is that the sensory motor account is and how it accounts for these kinds of uh,
You
phenomena.
want me to tell you about vision, or you want to tell me with regard to phenomenal consciousness?
I would just thought about vision specifically, but if you want to talk about phenomenal consciousness, you can. Yeah, whichever one you prefer.
Well, perhaps the easiest, we can take the steps the way I took them, which was to look at vision. So the problem with vision is that the eye seems at first sight to be a terrible device because it's got a gaping hole in the middle of it, the so-called blind spot, where you don't see anything. And yet you don't see a hole in your visual field. And then there are other terrible problems, for example, which people are not aware of usually, which is that the color, color actually is only present in a very small 2-degree zone in central fovea, and in peripheral vision, our color vision is really pretty poor. So this impression we have of a colorful field in front of us uh, um, is sort of mysterious. And then, of course, there's all these interruptions due to eye movements. So how do you explain that? You don't see the world uh, uh, with all these defects. And the
Mhm.
classical view to explain it is to say, well, we have an internal representation of the outside world which has defects because of the eye's defects. And then the brain, by some compensation mechanisms, corrects the defects by, say, filling in the blind spot or
Mhm.
correcting for a lack of color in peripheral vision. And so people actually, scientists, over many decades, started looking in the brain for evidence for these compensation systems, and there was a lot of discussion and literature on this. But I
Mhm.
realized that that there was a completely different way of thinking about what seeing is, which completely obviated the need for these compensation mechanisms. And that way of thinking was to say that seeing is not making an internal representation of the outside world.
Mhm.
Seeing is not contemplating some such Cartesian theater type thing. Instead, a useful way of thinking of seeing, a more useful way, is to say that seeing is an interactive activity where one is probing the outside world and obtaining information, rather than the same way as a blind man with his hand probes the world with his hands as he walks around.
Mhm.
So, for example, the blind man has gaps between his fingers, and yet one would not be tempted to think that one needs a compensation mechanism to compensate for the gaps between one's fingers when one feels the table, lest the table would seem to have holes in them.
Right.
So if you think about vision in rather the same way as one thinks about tactile exploration as an active exploratory interaction, then it turns out that you completely get rid of the need for these compensation mechanisms. And
Uh-huh.
this led me to the prediction that actually what we seem to think is a rich visual field in front of us is sort of an illusion because um, in fact, if I have the impression that there's a red door off in my peripheral vision, I'm convinced that I see this red door in my right peripheral visual field. In fact, the fact is that you do not have really sufficient information to really know exactly what the color is, nor that it's a door. And the fact that you think you see it derives from the fact that if you were to wonder what there really was there, you could immediately flick your eye over there and get the information. So
Mhm.
it's the immediate availability of the information in peripheral vision through the movement of your attention or of your eye that gives you the impression that it's there continually.
Right.
So it's like I always give the analogy of the light in the refrigerator. You know, when you open the refrigerator, the light seems to be on, right? And you close the
Mhm.
refrigerator. Well, is the light still on? You open the refrigerator. Yes, it's on. So the reason you think that the light is continually on is because whenever you look, it's on.
Mhm.
And that is why we feel that our feeling about the richness of the visual field derives from the immediate availability of information at the slightest flick of your attention or of an eye. So one could say that it's an illusion. Perhaps the word illusion is the wrong word, but it's just a way of showing that having a static internal representation may not be the right way of thinking about vision. One should think about the problems of vision in terms of active exploration.
Mhm.
Now, one doesn't always have to move around. once you've moved your eye over to the red door, and then you move your eye away from the door, then you know that the door is red, and you continue seeing it as red, even though actually the information is not currently impregnating your retina. So
Yeah.
the feeling of seeing the door continually derives from the potential ability to get that information through moving.
So one question that I have about the kind of view generally speaking is what you're going to say about certain kind of neuroscientific data that we have already. So we have lots of evidence that the visual cortex is retinotopic, organized in a certain way according to the spatial visual field. We have evidence for certain kinds of neurons in the hippocampus and related areas, grid cells, head cells, place cells. So if these are not like part of an internal representational system, then how do you interpret those kinds of activities?
They are, I don't know what you mean by a representational system. They are, they are doing processing in the brain, which allows you as a seer to, to, to act appropriately with regard to the information out in the visual field.
Hmm.
But using the word representation seems to suggest a Cartesian theater kind of thing, where you have a place in the brain where the information is somehow displayed, and then the question arises, who is looking at that display? And
Uh-huh.
and and it causes you to think that that display that is displayed in the brain has to be perfect. It must not have the defects that are the result of the defects of the visual apparatus. Whereas you if you consider that what's going on in the brain is just what's enabling you to appropriately process the information in order to respond and act appropriately, then you don't care so much about those defects,
Hmm.
provided the appropriate processing can give you the appropriate behavior. So it's not that I don't think there's information in the brain. It's just that using the word representation leads one along a dangerous path of trying to think that it has to somehow resemble the impression we have of when we're looking at it.
Hmm.
Like, for
Uh,
example, you might think that in order to perceive the world as continuous in time and not interrupted by saccades or blinks, for example, that
mhm,
you would need the appropriate activity of the neurons in some visual area to be continuous in time.
mhm.
Like, it's as though processing would have to be some kind of purring or humming motor type activity going on, and only then would you have a sensation of continuity. But my refrigerator light analogy shows that you can get the impression of continuity without there being actual continuity in the brain.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I guess what I'm trying to understand is like to what extent is your view anti-representational? Because you allow that there's informational states in the brain. You allow there's information processing. Um, and at a certain level, if you think that a state of the brain carries information about something in the environment, then there's a sense in which what I mean, that seems like the beginning of something representational. Since one model of what representational content is kind of carrying information about something in a certain way, that's used by the system in a certain way. So, but it sounds like you want to deny that because of how you think that that can mislead theorists in thinking about representations. But I guess I
So
mean,
I'm not denying that the brain is doing stuff. It's just that I don't like the use of the word representation.
uh,
It's the word that I don't like.
okay, yeah,
Because
that's
for example, I think in consciousness research, for example, my impression is, although again I'm not a philosopher, so I don't read the literature perhaps with the right attitude, and I don't read enough of it. But often, you find that you perceive something when it is represented in the brain. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? There's obviously information in the brain.
Uh-huh.
What does it mean to represent, and why having a representation of something should make it somehow perceived? Perception is not. It's just begging the question of what perception is to say you perceive when it's represented in the brain.
Yeah, that's an account of what it is to perceive. I mean, I think we're both trying to. Um, I mean, when it comes to perception and so forth, I'm one of these people that overuse the notion of representation, perhaps, but I agree that, like, with respect, what we're trying to explain is the behavior of an animal, creatures like us, as well as animals in the environment, and to say that they are informationally sensitive to certain properties in their environment. So, um, one theoretical account of what that might be is that they're in states which allow them to be informationally sensitive to that, by representing certain aspects of it.
Representing, representing.
That's one kind of theory. I was just asking if you thought that we had evidence for that kind of theory, or if you thought that
But
that
how
was
can
kind
it
of
be?
misguided to
What,
think, because a lot
what
of the
could,
standard textbook stuff is put in these sort of ways. And so I was just wondering what your response to that was, basically.
for me, that's not a theory. What you just said there is a tautology. It's obvious that if you can respond to something, then something must be on in your brain that allows you to respond to it. So just rephrasing that in terms of complicated language like informational sensitivity and representation doesn't add anything
Uh,
to the fact that something is going on it doesn't clarify anything to say that, in
Yeah,
my
well,
mind.
I tried to add that it was information which was available to systems, in the organism that we're looking at, or whatever the case may be, that there's information which is available internally, so that have
But is
states
that a
which make
theory?
that.
Does that explain anything? I mean, obviously, if an agent can respond appropriately to some external stimulation, some information about that stimulation must be available to its brain in order to allow the brain to respond appropriately. It's not a theory; it's an evidence to me. What other theory could one have? What alternative could there be to that?
Well, I took it that you were trying to articulate one alternative to that, which is that instead of building up an internal representation, you use the world as a kind of its own model, as the phrase sometimes goes. So that you still, so that you would de-emphasize the notion that there were states of the organism that carried that information in a way that was used by the mind of the organism, because that's what representations are. That's what they're doing. Um,
Well, if that's
Maybe
see
there's
for me,
something about format, and maybe there's something about, more fancy that you would want to lay on top of that. But the basic idea is just that there are states that characterize the ways things would have to be in the world if the states were accurate.
how could it be otherwise? I cannot that I have nothing against that. It's just it's the it's the idea that that is somehow an explanation of something that doesn't help in any way to explain what's going on. It's just
Well, I don't want to get too distracted by this, but so one way it could be otherwise is like the way that we measure the boiling and freezing temperature of using a thermometer. So the old school way of doing that is to take some um, mercury, put it in a tube, and then put that in the water when the water's freezing, and then whatever level that goes to, you simply mark zero. Then you put it into boiling water, whatever level it rises to, you mark 100, and then you have your scale set from 0 to 100 in a way that can't really be wrong, and we wouldn't really want to characterize in terms of representation. There's something we're imposing on it, that we're using this as a way to represent something, maybe, but the system itself doesn't have that
I'm
characteristic.
afraid
Whereas there does seem to be systems in the brain that do have this kind of characteristic,
I
where
didn't.
there's
Sorry, you have to explain this again. Sorry, I didn't understand. So the thermometer is not a, the way talking about a thermometer is not the same as talking about an agent that acts in an environment, right?
Right.
So,
No, I'm using it as a contrast.
so can you explain that again? I'm afraid I didn't understand.
Well, here it's supposed to be an example of a case where there's something that's not representational, um, which is that if you take the thermometer, so it's just some mercury in a tube, and if you put that into some freezing water, then the mercury will contract to a certain point, and you could mark that point zero and say we'll call that 0 degrees.
Okay.
And then you could put that same thermometer into a boiling pot of water and it could expand. And whatever
Yeah.
level it expands to, you just draw a line and say that's 100. And then you can mark regular distances in between and get a scale from 0 to 100. And it will
Yeah.
tell you, something about the temperature of the water, but it's not as though it represents it in the sense that we were talking about before, because the information that the system embodies, we imposed on it, and it's not used by the system itself for any kind of control or any kind of process that related to the control of its behavior. Whereas within the brain, there does seem to be states that do kind of meet these requirements, where the responses, like for example, I'm thinking of, just take the classic experiments where they show the bar of light and measure the response of the neurons in area V1, it does seem natural to say, well, that represents a line in the environment because you see there's the stimulus, it's got this angle. These cells are responding only when light is at that particular angle moving in a certain direction. So many people interpret that to be evidence for the representational states, and then we can use those to build up. So that anyway, so yeah, you disagree with that, I think, but I was wondering, like, how do you
No,
interpret that kind of evidence?
I
And,
don't disagree.
and that's different than the thermometer kind of response. That's the key contrast, I think.
I'm afraid this conversation is going to be very difficult because I just don't understand the distinction you're making there. Obviously, the cells in the visual cortex that are responsive to lines, moving lines, for example, they they are responsive to the moving lines, and these are made use of by other areas in the brain to allow the brain to respond. It, um, I just object to the use of the word represent to say that those cells that are sensitive to the line represent the line. What does that mean? Using the word represent seems to suggest that somehow the lines are being perceived by the brain as lines. Whereas in fact, those cells may not at all be seeing lines in any sense. They may be being used as part of a massive population code that allows the brain to respond not just to lines, but to all sorts of other stimuli. It's not even clear that I mean, and certainly they are not only sensitive to lines. You can, they're sensitive to all sorts of things. In
Yeah,
order to see a line, you need a population of many cells that have many different properties. Uh, so to say that they represent the line seems to suggest that this representation is being seen by other parts of the brain,
uh,
and we don't know how they're being seen.
I mean, I don't know why it would carry the suggestion that they be seen, be- because of what it's carrying. The suggestion is that there's a characterization of how the world would have to be in order for the state to be accurate, and that if you just activated those systems alone without the stimulus in the environment, the organism would respond as though the stimulus was there. Now, I
Yeah.
guess you're going to say, yeah, so what? Because you just get produced the same kind of activity. So if it's wired in the same way, you'll get the same response. But it starts to look like maybe there's mostly just a verbal issue at that point.
For me, this is just a verbal issue. It's
Uh-huh.
just that the word representation has led, in the study of vision anyway, as concerns, for example, this question of the blind spot and the stability of the visual world, thinking in terms of representations, it's just the word itself has led people to believe that there was a need for these compensation mechanisms. That's my only, but I have no issue with the fact that there are cells in the brain that are sensitive. I prefer just using the cells as sensitive to moving lines. But but saying that they represent something is really something which an observer from the outside could kind of deduce post hoc, after the fact, and saying,
Mhm.
well, in order to explain the behavior of the line, of the activity of that cell, in the context of the agent's behavior, I could say that that cell represents the line. It's a little bit like I don't know, let's take a computer program, right?
Mhm.
Um, take the memory in a computer. The memory in the computer could perhaps, at a moment during the execution of the program, it could correspond to a pixel on a picture that is currently being processed by the computer. And you could say, well, that memory location at that point represents the pixel in the visual field of the computer.
Mhm.
But that's only at that moment, and it's only during that particular type of processing. At a different moment of processing, that same memory location might represent something completely different. And
Right.
and and this story of using the word represent
Mhm.
is a story that we as external observers impose upon the functioning of the computer in the context of its functioning. It, it's not a matter of fact. It's not something inherent in the computer. You know, a
Mhm.
different computer program, this pixel could be used for other purposes. This memory location could be used for other purposes.
Right.
So saying that cells represent the outside world is tendentious, and it could be true at certain moments. Uh, but again, it's just a description that the scientist makes from the outside in describing the behavior of the system.
Uh-huh. So, I mean, I guess I'm
It's
curious,
for
like,
me,
so
it's just
what?
a verbal. It's a verbal issue. It's not a factual. I have no problem with stuff going on in the brain. It's just that I think the notion of representation is tricky.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Okay. So, what do we replace it with then? So you want to replace the notion of representation with the notion of a sensory motor contingency or law, as I understand things. So can you tell us a little bit about how that replacement is supposed to go? I mean, you said a little bit already about how you move and so forth and so on, but um,
I'm not replacing the notion of representation with sensory motor contingency. I'm getting rid of the notion of representation completely, and I'm using words. I'm trying to understand how the 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 agent in his environment, how to explain the way the agent feels and what he says about his mental and perceptual processes. Uh, uh, that's what I'm trying to do.
okay, well, by replace, what I meant was like you want to use sensory motor contingencies in to explain the sensory quality of redness as opposed to representations. That's what I meant.
Right, right, right.
Uh,
So, yeah. So, for example, saying that, imagine that you said, well, you see red when there's a module in the brain that represents red things
mhm.
is activated. Okay. Now, that for me is extremely dangerous language, right?
Okay.
How could it, how could it be that, a module in the brain, its neural activity when it's triggered creates or generates the feeling of red? That just does not make any sense to me.
Hmm.
And it's that that causes the problem of qualia and the hard problem and all that. If you think of what it means to say you're experiencing red, it is not having a representation in your brain. Having a
Was that?
representation of the brain, if that means having information that's sensitive to some outside state that's red, okay, sure, you have stuff in the brain that's sensitive to outside stimulations that are red, but having something going on in the brain does not explain why that gives you the feel of red rather than green or the smell of an onion.
Uh, yeah, so that's the traditional hard problem of consciousness, what you think
Yeah.
can't be explained. But it does. Don't you get a version of this on your own view as well? So mm, let's suppose that we grant you the 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 point about the qualities, although I'll come back and ask about that in a second. But in addition to that, there are these other aspects, grabbiness and uh, embodiment and so forth, that do seem to, on your view, to be like composed or constituted by the brain activity. They don't involve. They're not the same thing as the qualities that you are experiencing, but they are something that you experience, and that is something that's reliant on the brain activity there, right? Or is that a misunderstanding of your view?
I, again, I just can you I didn't understand what you said there at all. So sorry. Yeah,
It's
it's really
okay.
yeah. So just say one of those sentences again, and we'll look at it in detail.
Okay.
So you said the
Um,
grabbiness is constituted. The grabbiness is
well,
in the brain.
yeah. So, like for example, when you discuss dreams and hallucinations, you
Yeah.
say, well, this is not going to be a problem for my sensory motor view because you're activating the brain areas that are involved in this other component, which is distinct from the phenomenal bit, uh, which made me think
Uh,
that there was something about that was generating the experience. So
I
you got a
didn't.
version of the
Sorry,
same problem.
I didn't understand. Again, sorry. Sorry. Say that again. What do I
Well, just
say?
tell me what happens when you have a dream on your account.
Okay. No. Before I answer that, let
Yeah.
me look at it. Let me answer a, a highly related question, which is what happens when you see.
Okay.
Let's say I'm looking at an apple and I'm really seeing the apple. Okay.
Okay.
How do I know that I'm seeing the apple? Okay. So what does it mean to say I'm seeing the apple? What does it mean to say I'm really seeing the apple?
Hmm.
So what it means to say that I'm really seeing the apple is that I know that certain things are true. For example, if I move my eyes over the apple will translate across my retina. I know that if I close my eyes, the stimulation caused by the apple will change in a certain way. I know that if the apple suddenly rolls off the table, this will trigger my attention because of the sudden movement, and my eyes will move towards the apple, and I will become aware of this movement of the apple and be surprised.
Hmm.
The, I know also uh, that uh, the slightest movement of my body will create movement on the retina uh, related to the apple. That's what I call bodyliness. Grabbiness is the fact that when the apple moves by itself, it attracts my attention because I have automatic in my brain. I have automatic systems that register sudden changes, and it causes my processing to be oriented towards those sudden changes. That's grabbiness. So all those things uh, are are facts that I can verify by moving or by noting what happens when the apple moves by itself, etc., which give me confidence that I am currently looking at a real apple.
Right.
Okay. Now, when I'm dreaming of an apple, I can several of those things are no longer are true. Like, for example, if I'm dreaming of the apple, I can be convinced that I am in the same state as I was when I was actually seeing the apple. No, no, sorry, let me go back. Let's go back to what happens when I'm actually seeing the apple.
Mhm.
Note that in order to know that I'm really seeing the apple, I have to have moved and I have to have noted that the apple will attract my attention when it moves. But at this moment, I am not moving. And at this moment, the apple is not moving. And yet, because I know that in the past, these these things could happen, I have the faith that I am really seeing at this moment.
Mhm.
So it suffices for me to have the faith for me to really be seeing the apple. I don't actually have to be doing anything, and that's what happens a lot of the time. A lot of the time, like uh, for example, I give this example of the harmonica in the paper bag. Did
Right.
you read that?
Yes.
So So if you've ever, it's really interesting to actually do this experiment. You put your hand in the bag, you feel whatever is in the bag, and you just don't know what it is. And then suddenly a veil falls, and you know it's a harmonica, and you feel the whole harmonica, despite the fact that you're just in contact with bits of it. So
Right.
it shows that it's it having made the necessary exploratory movements suffices for you to get this feel of presence of the whole thing, despite the fact that it's actually not really at this moment continually exciting your tactile senses. It's
Right.
like the refrigerator. It's like the refrigerator light illusion. You don't need continual activity. You don't need to be moving if you have this knowledge that if you were to move, you would get the appropriate feedback. That is what seeing is. That is what feeling is.
Right.
So it makes the explanation of dreams much easier because actually nothing need be going on in the dream other than that you have faith that if you were to move, etc., you would see the apple. You would get these grabbiness and bodiness.
Right. But is one having an experience at that point?
Yes,
Yeah.
because just like in the with the paper bag in the harmonica, you're having the experience, and just like most of the time, when in real seeing you're seeing the apple, you are not moving, and the apple is not attracting your attention.
Right.
So real seeing is almost just like dreaming. There's very little difference between them.
Right. But so that the point that I'm trying to make though is that in this case, there's something that it's like for you. You're having an experience as of seeing an apple. Um, the only thing that could explain that is the activity of the relevant brain areas. So,
No, no. What do you mean the activity of relevant brain?
well,
No, it's
that's
the faith.
I mean,
It's the faith. It's the
well,
knowledge that.
it's the neural activity underlying the faith then.
Yes.
So there's a kind of brain activity associated with that state, and it's generating a kind of experience, a consciousness.
What you think just like the humming of the machine, that for you to be experiencing something now, there must be some brain activity. It must be some humming, purring kind of activity that's generating the feeling of presence of the apple.
Um, I would say so, yes. I mean, so we have like, for example, from the Sperling kind of experiments, seem to suggest that you have, whether you think it's, so I'm sure you're very familiar with the Sperling kind of cases where they present the flash of the letters.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
in the partial report, people can name quite a few of them where they couldn't
yeah,
without in the post queue.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it does seem like they have a representation of the letters, whether they're conscious or not. We could debate that. I think I know what your view of the matter would be based on the things that you said earlier, but that's not what my point is. My point is simply that there's evidence that they have the information encoded in some way in the brain, uh,
yeah.
and so that seems to me to be
That doesn't mean that in order to experience something, there has to be activity in the brain.
Well, no, but it does suggest that we do have activity in the brain that's related to a lot of the detail of things which we see.
Nobody would deny that.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess it's just a matter of
You,
how you interpret it.
were
Um,
you were trying to argue that in order for me to be dreaming of an apple,
uh,
the area in my brain that has faith that I am currently seeing the apple, okay, has to be active.
yeah.
Okay. Now, what I'm saying is that is a mistake because because experiencing does not require activity of the brain.
Uh,
Experiencing is an an ongoing interaction with the world. Let's not talk about dreaming. Let's talk about experiencing the apple, um, experiencing that I'm seeing the apple now. Okay, so you say that to experience the apple right now, the area in my brain that has faith that all of the qualities of appleness are currently satisfied has to be active. Now, what I say is experiencing is not a brain state. Experiencing is something we do. So when I dance the polka with somebody, okay, I'm dancing the even though at this moment I'm completely immobile because I'm doing an about face in the twist of my dance movement. I'm not moving, but I'm still dancing the polka. And in the same way, seeing the apple does not require any activity in the brain. It just requires it's when you say you see the apple, what you mean is you're in a potential state. You're in a state of potentiality whereby if you would ask yourself, am I currently perceiving the apple? You would answer yourself, yes.
mm, mm, okay.
So I think the thing is that this is where I have such difficulty explaining my position because most people seem to somehow think that experiencing is something happening in the brain and that therefore you need brain activity that is doing this. But experiencing is not a brain state or a brain activity. Experiencing is a thing we do. It's a way of talking about our mode of interaction with things.
Right. So I guess, someone might push back on that by saying that there's the sense of experiencing that we mean to be invoking, which is that from Thomas Nagel, the what it's like, that there's something that it's like from my point of view. And that does seem to be something which, if you don't want to say it attaches to mental states, that's fine. You could say it's a property of the organism, that there's something that it's like to be me, in virtue of my being in various states or whatever. But that when we're talking about experiencing, we're talking about trying to explain the difference between the experiencing of red versus the experiencing of a sound. So, um, phenomenal consciousness then would be, I think, the thing that we're trying to explain. And I'm curious whether you think that that's something that can be explained, or rather that's something that has to be explained away, which is sort of sometimes I get the feeling, which is your ultimate view.
So, so there's two aspects. I think explaining why something feels soft rather than feeling hard, okay, is something that needs to be explained, and why softness is the way it is, why hardness is the way it is, why red is the way it is rather than being like green. That's something that I think I should be able to explain using physics, essentially. Um, and the 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 question of why I say things like it, there's something it's like uh, to see red, or something it's like to feel softness. Um, I think I also want to explain that. I'm not explaining it away. I'm explaining why people say what they say
Mhm.
about their experiences. I have to explain them, and I think I can explain them. So
But
when somebody says there's something it's like to have a color sensation, it feels like something to me. I think I can explain what that means,
but
why they're
see,
saying that.
it sounds like yeah. So it sounds like you're saying you can explain why someone would say that, but can you explain why there is something that it's like, as opposed
So how do
to?
you know? What do you mean there is something? It's how do you know there is something it's like?
Well, in my own case, it's something I think I know with like almost near certainty, if not certainty, that there's something that it's like for me.
That's what you say. That's what you say.
Yes, but I say it on the
And
basis of having that kind of experience.
yeah, that's what you say. And what I have to explain is why you say that, and why most people who have philosophical backgrounds say that.
Right, but this is why I think that it sounds like what you're doing is trying to explain away consciousness instead of
No, no,
trying.
because I really want to explain exactly what it feels like. I want to say why it feels like this rather than that.
Well, you just
And
said you
and
want to explain why people say it feels like this as opposed to like that.
well, listen, I want to do science. Science only talks about what people say or what can be said, can be measured.
Uh,
It makes no sense to talk about stuff that cannot be talked about from a scientific point of view. That would
well, you
just
can
be
make
like poetry.
indirect inferences to
Oh,
things based.
that's part of what people say. So I
Yeah.
have to explain everything indirect that can be said as
Uh,
well. So I'm not explaining it away. I'm explaining it. As far as science goes, anything that can be measured or can be agreed upon by people about their experiences, I have to explain it.
uh, except for the one thing, which is so. I mean, I am curious about just and I mean this generally about your reaction to illusionism. Do you see this your view as a kind of illusionism? I know you have an affinity with Dennett's work. I'm not saying that's good or bad, or that means you're an illusionist or not. I'm just curious if you think of this as an illusionist view, or if you think of it as somehow distinct from that set of views.
Also, I've had discussions with Keith Frankish, okay, uh, and for me, this question about illusionism is hard to understand because it seems to me that what Keith Frankish is just seems to me to be claiming is that something that seems to be scientifically self-evident to me, namely that the notion of philosophical qualia as such just makes no sense,
Uh-huh.
right? I mean, saying that there should be something which one cannot say anything, okay, because it's ineffable and strictly first person, puts it completely immediately out of the realm of science. So it's just not worth talking about. But on the other hand, I don't want to say that the feels we have are illusions. We all agree that red feels different from green, and we all agree that it feels like something rather than feeling like nothing, etc., etc. All these things that we agree on are definitely not illusions. They are things that we all agree upon, and they're very important in our lives. So I don't know whether I'm an illusionist or not. I don't agree that the notion of qualia makes any sense, but I certainly believe that feels, what I call feels, are are very essential to our lives and have to be. And I think I can, with my approach, I think I can explain why they are the way they are, and in particular, why people say that they feel like something rather than nothing.
Yeah. Okay. So because this is kind of where my question was coming from, and you sort of answered part of it already. But so from my point of view, when you want to try to solve the hard problem of consciousness, what you recognize is that, well, there's a question about why this particular brain state is related to any kind of experience at all. So why is this one associated with red instead of green, or not, pain or whatever?
Sorry, sorry,
And
sorry. Say that again. Start again. No, you said something about a brain state.
yeah, So
Go
the
back.
hard problem, and so people like me, when we think about the hard problem of consciousness, we're thinking about why any particular brain state is related to the to conscious experience in the way that it is. So why is this brain state related to green as opposed to red, or why not pain or anything at all or nothing? And if you
Yeah,
were to try to solve the hard problem, then what you would try to do is to help someone understand why being in that particular brain state gave rise to red. But it
right.
sounds like you think that that cannot be done at all. Like, so you agree that the traditional heart problem, explanatory gap, or whatever, suggests that a certain view about of physicalism can't be right. Right? Is that correct? I mean, you do think that.
I think that brain states do not give rise to experiences.
Mhm.
So obviously, you cannot explain why this brain state gives rise to the experience of red or green. So I reject the need to connect brain states to experiences. I say experiences are not brain states. Experiences are modes of interaction with the world. And it is a mistake to look in the brain in order to explain why the experiences are the way they are. So,
Right, but
for
so
example,
whatever it is that you give the account of, so
yeah,
suppose that we talk about just the sensory motor law that governs your interaction with red. So that thing, um, is there any sense in which you think you can explain why it should like appear red to us as opposed
yes,
to being swapped with green? Like, why couldn't they
yes,
be swapped in a
yes,
certain way?
yes, that I have to explain.
Okay, and
And I
how do you
think
do
I've
it?
started. So I have not managed yet to do the difference between uh, red and green exactly. But I don't know if you looked at my work with Filippono on color, where we really do show that a simple sensory motor laws can explain certain things about colors, namely why they seem more salient to us than other colors, why red, green, yellow, and blue are primary so-called primary colors, despite the fact that in actual brain excitation there's no evidence whatsoever for them being in any way special. So it's because the red, green, blue, and red, green, yellow, and blue are governed by certain sensory motor laws, which are much simpler than all other colors. But I have not yet managed to explain why red looks red rather than green.
Right.
However, um, but I think that the approach I have to say that the approach that I'm suggesting for color uh, must, if I am right, manage to ultimately explain why red looks red or green. Very much like I think I have explained why soft feels soft rather than hard. You
Mhm.
know my example, the softness of the sponge. I think many people, even my greatest doubters, will say, yeah, well, I mean, your account of what we mean by the feeling of softness does seem to make sense, right? It's the fact that when you press it squishes. That's what we mean by soft.
Yeah.
So
Well,
and,
that
and
was going to be my next question, actually. So I don't think that is what we typically mean by soft, or at least I could see how someone might want to challenge that because one thing you might say is yes, there's this mechanical action of squishing, but then there's
yeah,
also the subjective aspect of what it feels like to squish something.
yeah,
And one wonders why, on your view, why couldn't it have been the case that these were like switched? So when something feels
yeah.
hard, that feeling of resistance, why couldn't the feeling of resistance have been associated with the squish or vice versa, with all the same neural activity and motor contingencies and so forth and so on in place? What stops the feelings from being sort of
Be-
arbitrarily associated in the same way?
Well, because I think that if you if you think about what you feel when you're feeling something soft, you realize that what you're doing is you're squishing to check whether it's soft or not. If you were to squish and find that it did not cede under the pressure, then you would simply not feel it is being soft. It's like let's take let's take the difference between riding a bicycle and driving a car. Okay,
Yeah.
do you think it's conceivable that one could have the impression of driving a car while one is riding a bicycle?
Um, do I think it's feasible? Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's possible. Yes.
I
If
mean, a philosopher could can conceive of it like in an inverse qualia type setup.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's kind of
where
what
I'm
I'm getting
saying,
at. Exactly.
yeah,
So
I mean, you
what
see
on
that
your view rules that out?
in my view, it's a matter of definition. If you define what you mean by having an experience as interacting with the world following certain laws, then it's by definition essentially that you're ruling it out.
Right. But I mean, why can't like so someone who likes the identity theory could do the same thing and say, by definition, what I mean by an experience is this type of brain state.
Yes, but
So
that doesn't explain. There's still a kind of a gap between brain activity and actual softness. You know, so for example, uh, if I say try and give a scientific explanation of the feel of driving a bicycle as compared to the feel of driving a car, okay, would you go looking in the brain to explain those differences? Obviously not. I mean, looking at neurons, neurons obviously play an important role and are essential to feel the feel of driving rather than the feel of bicycle riding.
uh
But it's not in the brain. You're going to look to explain why they feel different. They feel different because you do different things.
I mean, I would have thought you would look in the brain to explain why they feel different. I mean, if one involves like a lot of activity in a certain area related to motion sensitivity, then that would explain differences. You would expect differences in the experiences to be
Yes, but the
explained in
rule.
terms of the differences in the activity of those relevant areas. So
No,
if
no,
you
but
so and
assume,
I think we have
assuming,
learned some
supposing,
things from looking
supposing
at
you
the
were right.
brain.
Supposing you were right. Supposing, okay, let's take driving a car and riding a bicycle. Okay, what you're saying is essentially what provokes the difference between the feel of one versus the other is the brain activities. And I'm saying no. Essentially, what you mean by feeling a bicycle riding is doing this and doing that, whereas when you're driving, you're doing this and you're doing that. Now, look, my explanation gives a much better scientific uh, uh, explanation of why they are the way they are. Okay, because I could explain, well, what's the difference between riding a bicycle and riding a motorcycle? What's the difference between riding a bicycle and a scooter and things like that? I could because I have access through scientific observation of all of the physical constraints that describe riding a bicycle, and I can describe in everyday language what I mean by riding a bicycle and what I mean by riding a motorcycle.
Right.
I can give you a reasonable scientific explanation of what they feel like and why they're different the way they are. Whereas if you look in the brain, you have to give me some explanation of why these neurons, when they fire, they give you the bicycle riding, and those, when they fire, they give you the motorcycle. And you have no a priori way of making that link because
Right.
neural activity
But
has
neither did
nothing to.
you when you like were asked to explain the difference in terms of sensory motor contingencies. You
Sure,
also said, "I hope I that has to be explained at some point," and so I concede as well that that would have to be explained at some point. But my point was just that there seem to be on equal footing here. They both kind of have
no,
an
no, sorry,
explanatory
sorry,
gap at
I
the
lost
end.
say all that again. I
I would
said
just
that.
I was just trying to argue that these two theories are on equal footing and that they both have a kind of explanatory gap at the end, so that I
No,
don't.
mine has not, because I can explain exactly in every detail why riding a bicycle feels the way it does, because it can describe in everyday language all the things you have to do to ride a bicycle and why they're different from riding a motorcycle. Whereas you have to say, well, what it is about the neural activities that somehow link to these fields rather than those fields.
Right. I mean, Yes, I see what you're saying, but I guess I'm objecting to the redefinition, since it seems to leave out the thing we were trying to explain in the first place.
Why do you say
Um,
that?
well, because what we're trying to explain in the first place is the feel, and the activities you're engaged in generate the feel, or are involved in generating the states which are involved in the field. But I don't think redefining fields in terms of the activity
See,
gets
that's
at the
very
thing that
interesting.
we're trying to explain.
You've put your finger here on the ultimate incomprehension between the two of us and between me and everybody else, I think. Because, see, you are absolutely adhering to the idea that what you want to explain is something extra, whereas over and above the actual activity that you engage in when you're feeling something. You think that you could engage in squishing the sponge and it would be perfectly soft, etc., etc. But somehow you think that you could then actually feel something completely different. You're adding in an extra quale, which has no, which could have an arbitrary link to the actual physical activity that you're
Well, we
engaged
don't
with.
know if it's arbitrary or not, but I mean, so there's cases where you can squish the sponge and not feel anything, like for example, a certain kind of sensory blind sight, for example. Um, and so there's a kind of squishing activity without any experience of the squishiness of it. And then you can have the squishing activity with the experience of the squishiness. And then you can have the experience of the squishiness without anything being squished. So there's this range of processes here that we want to explain. We want to explain why you could have a certain kind of behavior without the experience present, why you can have the experience and the behavior co-present together, and why you can have the experience without the behavior at all. And it seems like that's what we're trying to explain is the commonality between those three, which is the notion of the experience, whether it's present or not, whether there's something that it's like to be in those kinds of states. So that seems to be the kind of thing that we want to that we're trying to explain. And if
So
we
I
wanted to solve the hard problem, we'd want to say, well, why is it that this activity is related to a certain kind of experience? So, and that doesn't mean that at every moment you're driving, you have an experience of the driving. It means that there are certain states that every experience you have is going to be related to some component of the functioning of the brain. Um,
see everything you said there is totally incomprehensible to me. The language you're
but,
using
but
makes
but whether
absolutely.
it is or not, my point was just that your theory and this theory kind of have the same prediction if you take seriously the idea that there's something to explain called what the phenomenal property or the what its likeness. Um,
I didn't. I didn't. I didn't understand. I'm really sorry. I did not understand. My theory. I'm trying to explain why things feel the way they do. So that seems to be. Whereas you are not trying to. No, I didn't understand. I'm trying to explain why things feel the way they do, and I'm managing to do it by redefining what I mean by feel as things that you do. So things feel the way they do because when you do things, what you mean by having different feels is precisely those things that you do. Okay. So what, like if you ask the man in the street, what does it feel like to drive a car? They say, well, you press the pedals, you turn the steering wheel, you accelerate, you decelerate, and you feel things in your body is pushed around. All those things constitute the feel. And that is what the feel is. There's not the feel is not some brain state that is activated. If that were the case, obviously there are brain states that are activated, but the feel is not generated by the activation of those brain states. If that were the case, you would have to explain why this brain state gives you this feel rather than that feel. That As soon as you think about feels in terms of brain states, you are up against the explanatory gap because you
Yeah.
have no scientific way of making a natural link between this brain state and this particular feel. Whereas
Right.
I see what I mean by feels is the things you do. Okay. So I'm no longer faced with the problem of trying to link brain states to feel. I'm denying, in fact, that the brain states generate. There is the notion of brain states generating fields is a mistake.
Well, generating or being fields, or I mean, so I think
No,
that,
they're not.
like you said, this may be just a difference between us, but I take it as like an obvious starting point that we have experience, that there's something that it's like to be me, and that that's not exhausted by my interaction with the environment. In addition to those things you mentioned about driving, would also be the feeling of elatement and excitement, the visual perceptions that I have of the environment, the feeling of freeness, the thoughts that may. So there's many other things I think that don't involve something external to me. Although I'm not even really against externalism. I just think that uh, what we're after trying to explain is what it's like for me to be in that moment. And one way to kind of put my point is that you could be able to reproduce that um, without any of that other stuff going on. So, for example, in vision, they are actually trying to do this with respect to people who are blind, who were sighted but are blind. I know you like sensory substitution and all that stuff. So, this is a bit different, though, where they are trying to take glasses hooked up with a camera and then to stimulate the visual cortex in the way that's similar to how it would have been stimulated had the eye been functioning in the
Yeah,
normal way. And people, they can see phosphemes and they can see them well enough so they can read letters and stuff like that. So they're not just like normal vision. But the idea is that if you could stimulate the brain exactly as visual input would have stimulated it, then you should produce the exact same experience.
yeah, but that does not mean
Because
that that does not mean the experience is produced by the brain.
Well, it does seem to say to suggest that that view. I would say, why doesn't it mean that? I
No,
mean,
no, it doesn't.
if you could have the exact experience without the environment being involved in the way that you're suggesting, then it seems like
Look,
that brain activity is what's important.
look, if I stimulate my retina in exactly the same way as what would happen if I had my eyes open, then that gives me the experience. Does that mean that it's the retina that causes the experience? If
No,
I
because it
touch
has to
the
be
tip,
hooked up to these other areas. So we look for the area
oh,
where,
why? But that it just doesn't make sense. It does not make sense. It's a mistake to think the brain is generating experience.
well, I was more talking just about the idea that there is experience and that we know about it from the first person point of view. And I was asking whether you agree with just that.
Well, that's a different issue, right? Okay, so let's talk about that. I mean, just to close the preceding discussion, obviously, I agree that the brain is necessary for experience because in order to experience something, you as a person, you have to have a notion of self and you have to be able to deploy your attention in very much the same way as the higher order thought type theories suggest. You have to deploy your attention upon something or which you are currently engaged in doing, and it is that activity of deploying your attention in the appropriate way and being able to respond potentially and move potentially. That is what we mean when we say we're experiencing. Okay, but so uh, you were asking what and so the brain is necessary for all that, but that does not. It means it's sort of a category error. It's a category mistake to think that somehow that means that the brain is creating the experience. What we mean by the experience is being engaged in that activity.
Well, it depends on who you ask by what we mean, but I mean, so that's a possibility. On the other hand, we
Uh,
might mean by it that there's a feeling involved in some of these things.
That's what I mean
And
by having an experience. Yeah. What I mean when I say I'm having an experience is that I am, like when I'm driving the car, I feel the experience of driving. What I mean by that is that I'm engaged in doing various things. And that's what I call having the experience. See, I guess that's my point. My approach is to redefine what people mean by experiencing in that way, because using that notion of experience overcomes the need to make the link with supposed brain activities. Because under that view of what experiencing is not generated by the brain. So the question of the explanatory gap dissipates.
but there still is a physical state that's in the brain, which is allowing one to do
Yes,
this. And as the
yes,
point about the dreaming stuff was that if that state is activated and you also have an experience, then it does seem like, on your view, the experiential aspect is associated with that brain activity, not with the engagement with the environment. So that there does seem to be a similar kind of outcome on your view, which is that you have to explain why it is this kind of activity is associated
yes,
with that as opposed to the other thing.
yes. But you were going on to questions of why you said why there's something it's like for me, okay? And
Yeah, well, I
and
was just
and
asking, do you agree that from a pre-theoretical standpoint, we can say that consciousness exists, that it's a real thing, that there's something that is like from my point of view and from your point of view at all as well?
yeah, so first of all, I don't like the word consciousness because again, I think it's used in so many different ways. So in my approach, I'm talking about the way consciousness is used when I'm driving my car and I stop at the red light and I press on the brake and stuff, and I say I'm conscious of the redness of the light. Okay, that I'm an adult doing those things, and that notion of consciousness is the one that I'm addressing in my theory, and that notion has several kind of components, which are very similar to the components that they have in a higher order thought type theory, where there's this notion of self, which is kind of hierarchically accessing or concentrating its attention on some activity which it is engaged in, namely the activity of contemplating the red light and evaluating whether it's red or green. And and the fact that I am able to do that at this moment is what I mean when I say that I'm conscious of the redness of the red light. So that's
Hmm.
what I mean by being conscious of the red light. And 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 when you say that it's something it's like for me, okay, what do you mean by saying that? Well, in my article on Frontiers, did you see my article in Frontiers?
Yes.
So that article suggests that 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 you can kind of decompose the meaning of what people mean when they say that there's something it's like to have a perceptual sensation in terms of different aspects. So what they mean may be that it imposes itself on them, like it kind of imposes themselves on you, and you feel you are kind of being submitted to it. It's not something that you can control like a thought. So it has more of a grabby, imposing aspect. And it
Hmm.
has a modal aspect in that it's visual rather than auditory, what have you. A whole lot of aspects of what happens to you when you're perceiving the red light, which are different from when you're thinking about a red light, or when you're having an emotional experience, or when you're having, a digestive experience. So that I think my program, my wager would be that if you can tell me more precisely what you mean when you say that there's something it's like to me to perceive things, then if you can tell me what you mean by that, then I can approximate in a pretty satisfactory way what sensory motor interactions correspond to what you mean there.
Right. But even so, wouldn't there? So we could just reverse all the labels, right? So you have all these sensory motor contingencies to the environment, and it doesn't seem like it really matters on your view whether you call them red or green or blue or purple or hurt or happy. So you could put whatever labels you want on these things, calling the red one green, the green one red, the hurtful ones happy, etc. And it wouldn't change anything about how these things were related. Um,
Yeah.
okay, so do you do you think you could do you agree that that's something that you could do on your view?
Well, different languages give different words for different fields. So
Uh,
that's a concrete example of what you said. There are different words that are applied to red.
right.
Red, rouge, rot.
Right. So if you call the hurtful ones happy and the happy ones hurtful, the behaviors of the person would be the same. Um, but
Yeah, yeah,
right, so you could switch the labels, and then they would that they when they act like they're hurt, it'll be like what we would call acting like they're happy. Um, so once you go as far as just switching the labels, then could you not go a step further and switch what it's like actually? Like, do you think that is possible
no,
that you could? You don't.
no.
Okay, so why not?
Because what we mean by what it's like is what you do. You can't switch from feeling you're riding a bicycle to riding a car if when you ride the bicycle you do this rather than what you do when you ride a car. You can't switch how it feels because how it feels resides in what you actually do.
Well, I mean, if you're in a simulator of a car, you could be like on a bike actually, and it could be still giving you a simulation of driving in a car, feel like driving a
What?
car.
Yeah, well, then you would feel, look, then you would, if the simulator is giving you the same mode of interaction as a bike, well, then you feel a bike.
No, if they give you the mode of interaction of a car, but while you're on a bike.
Well, then you'd feel a car.
Yeah.
You, whatever the mode of interaction is, that's what you feel.
Well, you were just saying if you were on a bike, you couldn't have this feel, but I think you could, which suggests that it's not just interacting with the bike. It's something about something else that's going on that determines whether what
No,
it's like for you is riding a
no,
bike or not.
no, no. Let's be clear about this. Let's. So you're saying you're going to make a simulator where you're sitting on a saddle and you're holding a handlebars and you're pedaling with your feet, okay? And somehow, despite that, you feel you're driving a car. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So you
Well,
could
that's
have it so
impossible.
that when you move your legs, it stimulates the part of your brain that it feels like you're stepping on the gas, or stimulates the part of the brain that feels like you're sitting in a car seat. So that, or not the prejudice, the terminology, stimulate the part of the brain that is active when you are engaged in those activities. So you could
Oh, well, yes.
systematically rig it up so that those parts of the brain became activated in response to your movements on the bicycle.
Okay, well, that's possible. It would be very, very difficult to do
Yeah,
because, it,
totally. But
okay,
my point is that it'd be a way of feeling like you're driving a car when you're actually on a bike.
yes, but your sensors, your muscles and your sensors would be inputting information, which would be which would have to be information that is corresponds to a bicycle riding rather than I would it would have to be information that corresponds to what car riding involves. So the input-output relationships would still have to be simulated by the simulator
Yeah,
correctly. Yeah, that's it. What counts is these sensory motor laws. Okay, so if you're a brain in a vat, you could do a similar thing. But you'd, what I'm saying is that it's the sensory motor law that constitutes the feel.
right.
If you
But I
if
guess
you
that's what, see, that's what this whole part of the discussion has been about that I don't understand is if you agree that you could have those states active when you're not engaged in the activity, and then also you have the experience at the same time, but then you say that, well, it's not the brain state that's responsible for the experience, it's just a necessary component of it. But you vary the brain state, you vary the experience, you activate the brain state, you get the experience. it does just seem like there's a lot of correlation between the occurrence of the state, its level of activity, and the kind of experience that you have.
Yes, I mean that's correct. But you could have somebody else. Like if I take somebody else, their brain would be completely different, but they would still have the bicycle riding experience if the appropriate sensory motor contingencies were looking at people's brain states does not tell you very much about what they're feeling. What tells you what they're feeling is what they're doing.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I can see what you're saying. Like in a way, there's an old joke in psychology about this. Is like someone's depressed and you do an fMRI and say, oh, this part of the brain's active. But the reason they're depressed is because they got divorced or their dad died or whatever. So the depression is a result of something that happened in the environment. So that's kind of
Right.
um, saying that they're depressed because their brain is in a certain state is kind of mixing up the level of explanation. Sounds like you're saying something in a bit of a similar way, I guess. So the only thing that I've been pushing on is two things, which is one, which is why to prefer one of these instead of the other, given that it seems like both of them are trying to give an account of something. And then one reason to prefer one instead of the other, I've been trying to argue, is that we're trying to account for something that's real and exists, but you're saying you don't want to account for that. And that seems to me to be at odds with the way our ordinary experience is.
What am
And
I
you're
not?
saying no, it's not. That the ordinary experience is like on my side. So I think there's a disagreement there.
Sorry. Say that again. You're saying that that the advantage of your view compared to mine is that your view is able to account for something, which
Yeah,
I say does not exist. And that
exactly.
thing that it cannot account for is what?
Phenomenal consciousness.
But I account for all the aspects of phenomenal consciousness.
No, you
Everything people
redefine
say.
it in terms of something else, which is what people are doing and how what they say, which leaves out the cause of all those doings and sayings,
No,
which
no,
is
no,
the
no.
thing itself. It's like saying
No.
I can explain the rustling of the bushes and therefore that's what a duck is. Well, no, the duck is the thing we're trying to explain. That's what's in the bushes. That's what's causing the rustling. So if you redefine duck as like the rustling, then yeah, you can explain that, but that's not the same thing. It's like that's so my what I'm saying is on my view, what we're aiming to explain is the actual thing, and that's um,
Right.
an
So I claim the
advantage.
actual thing. I say the actual feel of car driving resides in everything I do. The wind rustling in the wind blowing in my hair, the things I do when I press the accelerator. I say the feel of car driving is not a brain state.
Yeah, but
That's
each
what the
component of that
down
is
on the street.
each
What? Of
component of that thing that you're discussing is related to the brain in a certain way. And for example, the
course.
feeling of the hair being blown in the wind, we can trace that to a representation, let's say in the somatosensory cortex. And then if we stimulate that part of the brain, we get a sensation related to that body area. So
Exactly wrong. That's exactly wrong.
it is.
I'd say it
Okay.
exactly the I said exactly the other way. I'd say that what we mean when we say that we have the feel of driving a car is that we're doing certain things. We're pressing the brake, we're stopping at the red light, uh, and so on. It's not what we mean is not that we have our brains being activated in this way or that way. And the advantage of my view is that I can explain why car driving feels more similar to tractor driving than it does to bicycle driving, because the things that you do can be in natural language related. Whereas if you were to look in the brain to explain why motorcycle riding is more similar to if you looked in the brain to explain why tractor driving is more similar to car driver driving than bicycle riding, you'd be hard put. You've got these thousands of millions of neurons, and you would never figure it out. And also from one brain to another, there would be completely different explanations you'd have to give. You'd
I
just be
mean,
looking in
but
the
so
wrong
that's a
place.
very complicated experience. If you look at simpler experiences like color, there is some reason to think that the neural activity associated with seeing red is more similar to the neural activity associated with seeing green than it is to the neural activity associated with seeing um, gray or brown. Um, so that whereas the physical stimuli, there aren't these resemblances there. And of course,
It turns out that that's actually false. The best way to explain what colors feel like is much more complicated, and it is highly uncorrelated to neural activities. If you look at our paper with Filipona, we have some references about that.
uh-huh.
You
Okay,
cannot you
so
cannot deduce. Yeah,
it's an interesting empirical question. Okay, so I didn't know about that, that you think that there's reason to doubt that. Okay, so, but at any rate, though, oh, the kind of point that I'm trying to get at is just whether what we're trying to explain is a property of the organism itself, namely that there's something that it's like, and then explain the particular ways. So even if you interpret it your way and you say it's not in terms of brain states, there still is something that it's like for you to be driving the car, to have the wind in your hair, and there's going to be some physical state which is present when you have those experiences. And I still think that you owe an explanation of why it's associated in the way that it is. Now, your strategy is to say, no, I want to redefine it simply as just being that activity. But it does seem to me as though you've left out the primary thing, which we start off trying to explain, which is the feel.
but I thought that in my Frontiers article, I satisfactorily explained, or I was approaching an explanation of why people say that there's something it's like.
Yeah, but even if you have all those things, you still have the question of why does it feel the way it does to have those things to which you posit.
Well, that's what, yeah, you have those things about the degree of control that explains why people say there's something it's like. And then you have the sensory motor laws themselves that distinguish between red and green or between hard and soft, which explain why they look red rather than green or hard rather than soft. So I can explain both why people say there's something it's like at all, and I can also explain why the things are like the way they are, why red looks red rather than green. So I can explain both aspects.
I mean, I haven't really heard an explanation except for you saying, "We'll redefine what we mean by these things," and then we get an
Well, you tell me
explanation.
what you mean by what do you mean by there is something it's like to feel red?
I mean, the redness of the red.
No, no, not the redness.
Yeah,
I'm talking
what
about
it's
the fact
like to have the
that
redness.
there is something it's like rather than nothing to see the redness, to see
Uh,
anything, or to hear or whatever to experience. What do you mean by that?
um, what I mean by it is the thing which is in common between every experience that I have that's conscious.
Yeah,
So when
yeah.
I
What is it?
hear a sound and when I see a color,
Yeah.
there's they're different in terms of the sound and the color, but what they share is that there's something that it's like from my point of view.
Well, and
Um,
what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Why do you say there's something it's like rather than nothing?
because I'm kind of just directly, I mean, I think you have to start from there. You're kind of just
But
directly
that's
acquainted with it from their first person point of view.
But that doesn't work. I'm sorry. As a scientist, I can't accept that.
But it does.
You,
I mean,
you
so
have to say something. You can say, well, I'm directly acquainted with it. Not only that, but my friends and relations and everybody else would agree with me in saying that indeed there is something it's like. And then I say to you, okay, I accept that you all say that there is something it's like. But I, as a scientist, I have to figure out, I have to explain it. And I'm trying to explain it in my Frontiers paper. I try and say, well, what might people actually mean when they say that there's something it's like rather than nothing? And I think I've made progress in doing it. There's the modal issue. There's the there's the imposingness. There's and then there are the intramodal differences. There, uh, there are all these aspects which I think I can approximate by from my sensory motor point of view. Whereas somebody looking in the brain is never going to be able to do very much because, first of all, people just being satisfied by saying, "Oh, well, we all agree that there's something it's like, but we can't define what we mean." We know it intimately, but we can't define what we mean. That is scientifically unproductive.
I'm not sure how though, because well, we can agree that we're not trying to define it. At least I would say that you can't define it. You have to kind of just point to it in a certain way. But it's associated with certain brain states, and we have evidence that links the two, so we can still do science. I don't see why it's anti-scientific or something like that to say that to take the subjective
It's
first personal component of reality seriously.
it's going to be very difficult to do any empirical experiments to test any theory where you're trying to show the existence of something that you cannot, by definition, define. If you say that part of what you mean by there's something it's like is that you cannot talk about it, you cannot define it more precisely. Okay, well then doing science about that is hopeless.
Well, we can say give examples of it, and I think it's often the case in science where you start with something as an example of something and try to figure out what it is. This is a kind of more extreme version of that. We can point to it from our own first person and say, this is the sort of thing that we mean, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the angerness of anger, whatever the case might be. And then we look to see, like, well, okay, so how are these things, like, what's a good theory of these types of things? You have one account, there are other accounts, so then we go about our theorizing. But it seems like that we want to start with the recognition that before you do any theory, there's something there that we want to explain. Whereas, like, what you're doing is the like the heterophenomenology, the Dennett kind of move, where you say, "Look, I don't explain that. I can't explain, but what we can explain is what people say about it, how the reactive attitudes they have, the sort of things that are characterizable in third personal terms." And I'm not even denying that consciousness can't be characterized in third personal terms, but I'm just saying that there's you got to start, like, part of the data that we have starts with the first person, and to deny that, I think you're missing kind of the thing that we're looking for.
I, I'm I'm saying that you have to assemble statistics about what everybody agrees from a first person point of view. I'm not denying that first person's views should not be should be used. I'm saying you can't just take one person's view. You have to take first person views from a number of people, and if they all say, yeah, well, I think there's something it's like, well, then you can take that seriously, and then you can try and explain why they say that. And that's exactly what I do in
Right.
my.
But it isn't one explanation that they have that there is something that is like for them, that there's phenomenal
Sorry, sorry,
consciousness. I said one
sorry.
explanation would be that it is the way they think it is, that there is phenomenal consciousness.
I don't know what you mean by phenomenal consciousness. People say that they have feels. They say red is red and different from green. If you want to call that phenomenal consciousness, yes, and I don't deny that.
Well, I want to talk about the thing that causes them to say that, the thing that they have, which in response to they say things like, "Oh, there's something that is like for me."
Well, that's just. I really see. It's very interesting. Listen, this discussion has been very interesting for me, and it just goes. I still. It's to me. It's a very much like the question of vital spirit.
Mhm.
Science advances by redefining things like life. I think people who postulated a vital spirit had a view of life which is very similar to the view you have about consciousness. You think it's something extra that's added over and above what people do. Whereas now modern biology thinks life is just a collection of capacities. It's a collection of the capacities that certain systems have to interact with their environment. And the idea that there's something over and above this, namely a vital spirit, has been simply abandoned. And I think that there was tremendous metaphysical difficulty with that idea. And even in the 1950s, apparently, Crick was saying in a lecture that that half of the audience still believed were still ultimately vitalists.
Yeah.
And I think the same is happening with consciousness. And it's
Well,
just,
I don't
it's a
think
message.
it's a spirit. I just think it's a real thing. I mean, if you don't think life is a real thing, I guess you know that's a separate issue. But I think life is a real thing. It's a natural kind that exists. We've the difference between life and consciousness is that life, it was always kind of clear that we were trying to explain some set of capacities or functions. The debate was
That
over
was not
whether or
clear.
not they could be done by a
The
physical
vitalists,
system.
the vitalists thought about it the way you're thinking about consciousness, I think. They thought that there were these capacities, but they thought they could not be explained by physical interactions and that there was something extra, namely a vital spirit.
Yeah. Except I'm a physicalist, so I'm not. I mean, I'm not thinking that there's something extra. I just think that there's something real, which is not extra, but it's a real thing, which we start with, and most of our theorizing begins with the recognition that we have experience, that there's something that it's like to be us, and that we can differentiate between our experiences in terms of what it's like for us. So I don't think it's like vitalism at all. Um, it's like saying some things are alive and other things are not alive. The vitalists thought that you're right, that you could have all the mechanisms and that there still wouldn't be something that was alive. Um,
Right.
so that's the opposite of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you could have the physical state there. There would be consciousness. We don't need something extra. I'm saying we don't have an explanation for it, but it's likely that we could have one at some future date. There's no reason to expect that we wouldn't ever be able to provide some kind of account. But that also your own view seems to have the same kind of result, which is that if you want to say, well, why is this particular sensory mode or contingency linked with that experience? The only thing you can do is say, well, it's defined that way. You know, you can't, there's no like derivation from independent principles that would allow you to see it. So that you kind of ultimately have to admit that, yeah, the hard problem can't be solved, um, even with your preferred like alternative.
So you're sort of telling me that what it's like to drive a car is consists in all the things you drive a car. You don't disagree with that, but you say that there is an extra something it's like, uh, which cannot be at the moment physically explained. Is that it?
I don't think it's extra. I think that there's a state of the body or brain, or maybe it's involved in the activity and relation between you and the world. I mean, you could be open to
Yeah.
different ways of thinking about its nature,
Yeah.
but that there is something that it's like for you to drive the car. My own view
Right.
would be that you could recreate exactly what it was like by just stimulating the brain. In which case, it seems to me that the brain being in those states is what's importantly involved in you having that experience. And
Okay.
probably all of that you could agree with. It's only once you start calling them representations and try to label this stuff that you start seeing like you
No,
disagree.
no.
But
Well, I disagree with using the word representation, but I also disagree with saying that the brain is the cause of these, and that the what it's like is emerging from the brain.
yeah,
I have
but
an
I didn't say that though.
identity.
What I just said was that if you reproduce that brain activity, then you get the experience.
Yeah, but you're looking in the. Well, I agree on that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Uh,
You could agree with. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, but so what is our difference then?
Um, well,
You're still looking for something extra because you say that this what it's like. Uh, Needs extra explanation. Whereas I'm saying, well, what more is there to explain? If you tell me what you really mean by saying that this is extra what it's like, well, I'll try and give you an explanation in terms of sensory motor laws. But you don't seem to want to tell me what this what it's like is like. So I can't exercise my theory. You just throw your hands up in the air and you say, well, it really feels like there's something extra, but I just can't explain it. If I have the feeling that if you really look in detail at what you mean by saying that there's an extra what it's like, well then you'll realize that each of those things that you mean can be uh, can be explained in terms of sensory motor laws, like I did
Right,
in
but
my
you,
frontiers article.
but what you explain with the sensory motor laws is like why you behave or say something. But it seems like you could still have like a completely different experience associated with each one of those sensory motor laws, unless you just by definition say, well, what I mean by this experience is just acting this way. But short of doing that, it's not clear like why you couldn't have like arbitrary associations with the experiences and the sensory motor contingencies, which is
Yeah,
why it
but that's
doesn't.
what you're right. You're right in saying that by defining what I mean by a feel as things that you do, uh, I obviate that difficulty. You're right. It's a definition, but it's just like you know uh, the way science advances is by defining terms. So Helmholtz specified what was meant by the notion of force, and managed to completely revolutionize modern physics. Whereas before, people were using the word force in arbitrary ways. They used it to mean power or
Yeah.
energy or what we mean today by force. And once you become very precise about what you mean by a term, well, then you can do science. And I think that if you try and be precise about this idea of what it's like, then, and that's what I've tried to do in this last article I wrote. I think I demonstrate in the article that if you use that definition, then you can really make progress, and you can make predictions.
I mean, I guess that was sort of the last thing I was gonna, since you brought that up, the last thing I was gonna say about your view is that I think that a lot of the things that you say are predictions of your view are compatible with other views as well. So it's
But
not
that's
clear that
always the
they,
case. Epicycles was also an alternative view to elliptic orbits. There's always an alternative view.
yeah. But if there are several current like views that people are interested in, and they all kind of agree that there's an interpretation of a certain phenomenon, then you can't really use that phenomenon as evidence for any of the views, though. Would you agree with that?
That's always the case in science. What makes a theory useful is that it's productive. It makes predictions and it provokes new directions of scientific activity. And that's what happened with change blindness. It's because I had this view that vision was not as rich as it seemed. In fact, it was the very view that I'm taking about what seeing is. Seeing is a mode of interaction with the environment, is not representing something in the brain. It's that view that gave rise to the whole literature on change blindness.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and I,
scientifically,
I mean, of course, there's an alternative interpretation of change blindness, which is that it's not really a kind of blindness, but it's a memory failure or something like that, so that you maybe did have an experience of the thing which was changing with just without you being able to notice or be aware of it. Um,
that's not incompatible with my view.
it's not incompatible.
No. I mean, the fact is, you have information available in the brain, okay? And you can exploit that information now or later. And whether you're conscious of something, what you mean by being conscious is currently paying attention to that and making use of it in your present or future behavior, right?
Mhm.
So whether that information is in some memory that you were not previously accessing, or whether it's in some other circuits, doesn't make any difference. But the point is, the change blindness is a consequence of the fact that we are not simultaneously paying attention to everything in the visual field. We have to, what our impression of richness and 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 colorfulness and of the whole visual field spread out in front of us is caused by us sequentially having the possibility of, of accessing that information in the visual world, or possibly in our memories or in some short-term memory banks in low-level vision.
Mhm.
But the main underlying, I would say, metaphysical idea that seeing is not activating an internal representation. Seeing is the activity of interacting with the world. that was what predicted the change blindness phenomenon, and 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 there are alternative explanations that are still possible. Okay, but it was a productive idea, and I think that
Yeah.
my ideas about what it's like, like in the Frontiers articles, makes predictions about pain, for example, uh, uh, and and it made predictions about sensory substitution and stuff. So it's a productive scientific approach, very much like modern biology, the abandonment of the vital spirit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why you couldn't abandon the vital spirit without adopting your view as well. But I mean, I'm not against the view. I like it. I guess my main issue and what started all this was trying to understand how it explains the heart problem or gets rid of it. But now I think I understand that the way that you do that is by sort of acknowledging that as the heart problem stands, it can't be solved, and that it has to be redefined. And part of my pushback has been to try to argue for the non-redef. I don't think we need to redefine things in order to 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 challenge the hard problem. So, but I recognize that your point of view is a good one and that it's interesting. Um, I still just think that there's something that's left out, which is even evident in your theory about the colors. So if you have three of these primary colors, why think that one is like red and one is like green and one is like yellow as opposed to something else?
Hmm.
It doesn't seem
Right?
that the theory answers it.
No, it doesn't at the moment. Although, the theory says red is different from green and blue because the dimensionality of the space of possible interaction with red is one dimensional, whereas it's two dimensional for green and blue and yellow. So, so it suggests that red really is the simplest color compared to the other two. So it sort of partly explains why red really seems more special even than the special colors of green, blue, and yellow. Okay,
Hmm.
so that's a first step. But I admit, it doesn't explain why red looks particularly red rather than green. I, and
Right.
I
Oh, so that's why I
yeah,
was saying it seems like you get a similar kind of explanatory gap
yeah.
at the
But I
end
mean,
of
my
the day.
major, yeah.
Sorry. But so I recognize that I can't keep you here forever. So we've talked about a lot of stuff, but I'm wondering if there's anything which hasn't come up. Would you want to get the final, bring something up again, or resummate, or have a final word, or something like that at the end?
No, I think this discussion has been very, I should say, mm, difficult for me and typical of the discussions I've had with other philosophers. I was hoping to that you would be able to explain to me why I never managed to get across to anybody with this theory, which to me seems, you know, really the solution to the hard problem. And
But I have been
maybe
trying to
we
get that across. I mean, that the fact that it seems like it leaves something out, I think, is the reason.
So let's summarize. You think it leaves something out because you refuse to redefine what you mean by feel. You want to keep your definition of feel, which is that it is something going on in the brain.
No, no, I don't think that. I think that my definition of feel is that there's something that it's like. And then
But
I think that you can associate that with what's going on in the brain. That's a separate step, but it could work
wait, wait,
out.
wait, wait. Okay. So you say so. So you say that again without talking about the brain. You say that there's something extra, which is something it's like. But I've explained something it's like in my Frontiers article.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. I don't think you have done because you still have these questions about,
So
well, why
so
is it like
tell me.
that as opposed to something else?
So tell me. So what do you want to know? What more have I got to explain about what it's like? Let's take some particular experience. The squishing of the softness of the sponge. I think I can explain everything it's like to squish a sponge, to feel the softness. What more is there to be explained?
The what is like part, or the part
So
where
what do you mean by that? You can't
the
criticize me
experiential
until you
quality.
explain what you mean. So what do you mean by so the experiential quality? So what do you mean by saying it has experiential quality? That's exactly what I address in my Frontiers article. What do you mean by something being an experience? One thing you mean is that it imposes itself on you, and I have an explanation for that. Another thing that you mean by having an experiential quality is the fact that it has a kind of spread out before you quality. And I've tried to go into everything people might mean by what they say when they say that it has an experiential quality. What more do you want?
Well, why it feels the way that it does,
Well, I've
as
told you why
opposed
it
to
feels soft rather than hard. Okay, what do you want to know? Why it feels soft rather than what? What do you mean by
rather than
how it?
hard.
Yeah, I've told you why that is. If you
But
ask yourself what you mean by hard and what you mean by soft, I can then it is exactly explains the difference. So what
but
do
I
you
don't think
mean by
that's what I mean by it. What I mean is that there's a particular experiential subjective feeling associated with squishiness.
so what is it?
It's what it
You
feels
have
like
to
to squish things.
but what is it? What is it? I've told you what I think it might be. If you have other
Well,
ideas,
it's
tell
like the
me.
texture of the sponge,
Right. Okay, let's talk about the texture. Let's talk about the texture.
uh,
Okay, because when you squish a sponge, there's one thing that makes it soft, which is when you press it squishes. But the texture is something different. The texture can be rough or smooth. Okay, it can
yeah.
be sticky or smooth, right? What do you mean by rough? What you mean by rough is when you move your thumb along it, there's a kind of vibration. It's not smooth because when you move your thumb along it, it's so there again, I can explain exactly what you mean by rough versus smooth. Okay, what else
But
does
what I
this say?
mean is what the way it feels when there's that vibration, the
But what you
particular subjective quality of rubbing my thumb, feeling the contact, and the
yeah. So I think if you try and be more precise about every single thing that you mean by having this quality or that, every single one of those things that you mean is accessible through my sensory motor approach. And there's a very, very large number of them because the softness is not just the fact that when you press it, it squishes. There's also, as you say, the texture, the lightness, of feathers. You could say feathers are soft. The meaning of soft is not entirely clear. But everything you might want to say about softness, I claim, needs a scientific explanation. And my wager is to say that I can go deeper and deeper and deeper into every single aspect that you might want to mention by using the sensory motor laws.
right. But it just seems that no matter what you say, there's always going to be the question: why doesn't it feel like hardness feels? So
Well,
if
don't
you
you agree with me that my argument is that that what you mean by hardness is, among other things, the fact that it presses when it squishes. How could it possibly feel hard if when you press it doesn't squish? Okay,
But what I'm
I
saying is
would
you could
use that
squish it and
same.
get the experience of it being hard.
No, perhaps if somebody did some brain implants, etc., but then that would only be because those brain implants simulated the phenomenon that would usually occur when, if you press it, squishes. Because ultimately, the origin of, of the feel lies not in the brain, but in what you do. That's what you mean by a feel.
Yeah, I'm just not convinced that's what I mean. So I agree. It's part of what we mean that when you press it, it squishes. But there's a feeling associated with that, and it seems sort of like that the whatever results in you having that feeling. There's a question about why it feels that way as opposed to feeling some other way, which you haven't addressed. All you've done is say, well, you behave in a certain way, and that's what I mean by feeling.
But so that if you are the ball is in your court because you have to say what you mean when you say that there's this extra component. It's like you're saying there's these qualia and I can't talk about them. And so long as you keep talking about this extra stuff that you can't describe scientifically, well then obviously you can always hang on to your theory. But my claim is that you might as well give up because whenever you come out and actually say what you mean, then it'll turn out that that thing that you're talking about can be expressed in terms of everyday physical laws. And you don't need that extra thing.
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess I just come at it from a different point of view, where it just seems like it's like you're going around saying, here's a bunch of trees, and you name each tree Alfred, George, Bob, and then you're like, see, we don't need any forests. We all we have is individual trees, but of course, there's something that's there that also could be that could be accounted for, which is the nature of how those things relate to the larger entity. And
I didn't
so I
follow
agree
you.
that there is the doing and all that stuff, but then there is the experience.
So
Um,
what do you mean by the experience? Sorry, what do you mean when you say there's this? How do you know that? So tell me, how do you know that you are experiencing? What do you mean when you say you're having an experience?
well, there's a sense in which kind of having is knowing. So that's just having the experience is kind of knowing it. It's something I'm seemingly immediately acquainted with. I would say the experiential quality of what's happening to me at this moment, what it's
But how
like.
do you know it's an experience? How do you know
Say,
it's an experience rather than just knowledge?
well, I think having knowledge is a kind of experience.
Yeah, but it has a different quality, right?
Yeah.
What we mean by yeah. So how do you know what this extra thing that you're talking, this what it's like? Okay,
Well, I don't think it's
then
extra. It's just a thing.
okay, but what do you mean by what by having it? What is it?
It's a subjective first person what it's likeness, which you know by having it, and there's not really much more you can say than that. Which you kind of just assume other people have it too, and then they can point to their experiences and say, "What's that thing?" Whatever it is.
Well, if that's as far as you can go, well, then you can't do much science about it
Well, you
because you can
can
never.
actually.
No, you can just postulate that it occurs in people and that there's some extra substance. But since you can't describe it, you can never test whether this person is having it or that person is not having it.
Well, there's lots of methods for indirectly measuring things. We can't, we have dark matter and dark energy, not because of direct observation, but because of the indirect observations, and so we can still theorize about things that are not directly accessible to us.
Yes.
And consciousness is directly accessible from our point of view. I directly access my consciousness. So each of us has that at least access to it. And there are reliable correlations. Report is, you're right. That's really our best method. But there are no report paradigms, and there are ways to what we try to do is take the best overall summation of the total evidence and construct an account of what's going on the basis of that. Um, so I don't think we need to have certainty or rule out all possible counter objections, but certainly that's what we're trying to do. You can do that even if consciousness is, the way that I'm saying that it is. You don't need to redefine it in order to take it seriously. Although, if you want to, that's fine. I think there's an argument to be had here. I just don't think anything forces us to do it.
Well, I think my approach consisting of abandoning the idea that there's this extra magical what it's like stuff and trying to actually get down scientifically to qualifying what people mean when they say that there's something it's like that this that the that the scientific project of trying to actually get down and nail down what people mean when they say what it's like is a project which is worth pursuing
Yeah, I
and
agree.
effective. And so I think it's isn't it related to what Chalmers calls the meta problem of the meta hard problem? I mean,
Yeah.
essentially, I'm saying my purpose is to explain everything that can be said about the meta problem, but of course, you can continue believing in some extra thing which by definition cannot be described, namely qualia. If that's what this extra what it's like is, well then it's like poetry. It cannot be subjected to scientific analysis, but it's not productive from a scientific point of view.
But if it's a part of
So,
reality, then you need to take account of it. So the question is, like when
no,
people
no, because
say,
reality is what can be treated by science. If people talk about it, then you can analyze what people say, and that's what I've done in my Frontiers article. I analyze what it might mean to say that there's something it's like.
yeah, and it also might mean something else. I just think that there's actual matter of fact here, that things either are the way you say they are, or they're the way that I'm saying that they are, or some other way still. But that there is a fact of the matter about whether there is phenomenal consciousness in the sense that I mean to use it. Um, and it's, I mean, I know that, there's people like Dennett who think there's no fact of the matter, and that's one reason not to think that it's there. I just disagree with that sort of argument from the Quine Qualia paper. I don't think that it establishes what he thinks that it does. And I'm not arguing for qualia if what you mean is private, ineffable qualities, etc. But there certainly are things that seem to be that way. Whether they are actually that way is a separate question. But I don't think I personally don't see how you can deny that you start with your first person experience and then you work your way out from there. So and then there's what people say and what you say, but part of what people say is I'm having this experience and there's something that it's like for me to have it. So if you really
And
wanted
I
to
agree with
explain
that.
everything, you would want to explain what makes that true and
That's
not
exactly
just
what
that
I'm.
they say it though.
That's exactly my project, to explain why people say I'm having that experience and what it's like. And I think I'm managing better than people who shrug their shoulders and say these things are generated by the brain.
Well, we're not shrugging our shoulders. We're saying we need a theory of it. So we don't have it yet. But, that's like saying, what, mass and energy are identical to someone who doesn't understand relativity physics. They don't have any way of latching on to what you're saying. So we could be in a similar case.
To get a
I agree
theory
there's an
about it,
explanatory promissory note here. But I just don't see how taking your point of view advances us on the project. It reorients the project, and that's why I was kind of wondering, like, is it really the sensory motor view that's doing that, or is it this kind of a quasi illusionism that you have? So it's not really the sensory motor component that's doing the work, because you could still have a hard problem if you weren't an illusionist, even with the sensory motor view. But it's really this illusionism that's doing the dissolving or reorienting of the hard problem. So in
I
that
don't,
case, you could have many different kinds of views.
why the illusionism? First of all, I'm not sure I'm an illusionist. I mean,
Well, I
I'm
said
not
quasi
denying.
illusionism, yeah.
I'm not sure whether I'm a quasi or illusionist or
Okay.
whatever. I agree that people say that there's something it's like, and that there are differences and similarities between their different experiences. And my project is to explain exactly that and to explain what they say about them. So I don't know why you say that it's the illusionism that's doing the work. What's doing the work is to look not in the brain for an explanation, but in what people mean when they say that they're having an experience. And
Well, that's
if you
basically
look
the
at the,
illusionism bit, because what you're saying is we need to reorient it from the thing, consciousness itself, to what people say about consciousness. And if you take the meta problem approach, where all you're trying to explain is what people say about consciousness, then that's compatible with consciousness not really existing, um, or with it existing. So, but it's only if it doesn't exist that you actually get the explanation that you're going for.
I don't understand that. For me, when I say what people say about consciousness, I just mean everything that can be said or measured about consciousness. I'm just doing science. I'm looking at it as a phenomenon that can be addressed by science. That's what I'm trying to explain.
Yeah.
All science, all science ever does. Science does not tell you what really exists in the world. Science just tells you how to tell a good story about what people say about what happens in the world. There is no science does not. give you any guarantee about the existence of anything.
Right, but first person experience does. It tells you that consciousness exists.
No, first person experience, when it is confirmed by numerous people, is an interesting scientific fact. Okay, and that has to be explained.
Well, I don't think I need to have it like conferred with other people in order for it to exist. I'm simply saying that there's consciousness, we have it, and then we want to understand it. So science is a way to understand things. I think that we could understand consciousness from a scientific point of view. I don't think that we do now, but I think it's possible. I'm not a non-physicalist or a dualist or a panpsychist or anything like that. I'm open to those kinds of views. I'm not. I'm kind of, as you probably guess, more of an identity theory type boat. But of course, that's exactly the opposite view that you want to push on me. But it's a kind of physicalism at least. But all I'm saying is that there's some data which comes from the first person, which involves consciousness and what it's like. And then there's also all this other stuff about what people say and how they behave and so forth. But we need both sources of data. Whereas, like, you just want to, seems to me, you want to limit us to just one of those sources, which is just the third person stuff, and not take seriously the first person
No, that's not. No, that's not true. I take seriously the first person as soon as it
as a source of
is
data.
as a source of data. Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
that's what science does. That's what science does.
Well, it seemed like you were saying that it didn't, because it's not scientific if it's like, you take consciousness seriously as a real thing.
We can be wrong about what we experience, and I believe in heterophenomenology there, whatever. I think that's what it's called, and I think that the fact that everybody agrees that there's something it's like has to be explained. So if you want to call that, I don't know if you want to call that first person or third person, but the fact that everybody agrees on this, if there was just one lunatic who said this, well, then you wouldn't try and do science about it. The fact that everybody agrees makes it a thing that you have to explain. And that's what we mean by consciousness, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
nothing extra than over and above what people claim there is, right? Or you
Well,
can do
I
science
mean,
about
that way
what,
to me is a little bit dangerous because, like, you can make the same claim about Bigfoot. Um,
about what?
I said you could, if you like, you can make the same kinds of claims about Bigfoot. That all
About
there
what?
is about Bigfoot.
Bigfoot.
Yeah, Bigfoot.
What's what's Bigfoot?
Oh, he's the part man, part gorilla, ape. Um, you don't know about
I
Bigfoot?
don't know. Who's
The
Bigfoot? I don't know.
the Yeti.
Oh yeah,
Uh-huh. So there's a bunch of beliefs that people have about this being, but there is probably
right.
no such being. So
Yeah.
in order to explain everything that you want to explain about the Yeti, you explain what people believe about it and how they got those beliefs. But if the Yeti is a real existing object, then explaining just those things is not enough. So I'm trying to take the point of view that consciousness is not like the Yeti. We need to do more than to merely explain what people think about it. We need to take account of the actual thing itself. It's more like
I think,
a planet in that sense that we're trying to infer its orbit from the effects around it.
well, that's not incompatible with a scientific approach. I mean, science
Yeah.
says things are really the kind of, as a shortcut, a scientist will say the electron exists. Okay, but I mean, the notion of existence there is a result of long scientific investigation coming to coming to eventually use the term in a consistent way, and then we shouldn't really say the electron exists. We don't know anything about what really is there in the universe. The universe might have 21 dimensions. Well, physicists say it might have 21 dimensions. It might be something completely different from what we experience.
Yeah.
So, I mean, doing science, I don't think this distinction between what people say and what exists should be made, because science does not really make, should not make that distinction. When I
Um,
when I'm trying when I'm trying to explain consciousness, um, and when I say I'm trying to explain what people say about consciousness, what I mean is doing precisely what a scientist would do, which is to explain everything that can be said about consciousness. And I don't think there could be anything worth discussing in addition to that. So, I mean, when I say I'm explaining what people say about consciousness, I really mean what science can be done about consciousness.
mhm.
So I'm rejecting qualia because qualia, by their definition, cannot be treated by consciousness,
By
by science.
science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, this conversation is going around in circles, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, we, and it's exactly the same conversation I have with most philosophers. And nobody seems to be willing to take the metaphysical shift that I'm suggesting, which is to redefine what they mean by feel so that it is just a mode of interacting with the world. And, and taking that redefinition, I think, solves a lot of problems and, and, and avoids infinite discussions, uh, philosophical discussions, and it also avoids making scientific uh, investigations, which are, in my opinion, useless. It's like people looking in the brain for a filling in mechanism that fills in the blind spot. Looking in the brain for something that generates consciousness is a category mistake. Consciousness is not generated by the brain. Or rather, no, I should say, a scientific view that adopts the view that we should consider it'll be more scientifically productive to abandon the view that there is something that is being produced by the brain. Instead, science suggests that it will be much more productive to abandon that, just like we abandoned the ether hypothesis, and we abandon the vital spirit, and we just say, well, what we mean by consciousness is all the capacities that we might be referring to when we use the word consciousness. There is no single thing called consciousness. There's just a whole lot of things you can do, and they have different properties, and there's no mystery whatsoever involved. And I think it's scientifically more productive.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think that's a pretty good summary of your view. I do want to thank you for taking this time. Or you might not have convinced me, or I you, but nonetheless, I thought this was a good conversation, and I did learn a lot by rereading your book. I, of course, had read it a while ago, but I reread it and your subsequent paper. So I do think your approach is interesting and worth considering. So I'll put a link to the book and all that stuff so that people can check
Okay.
it out. But thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Well, thanks for your patience, and I'm really I'm gonna. There's a few philosophers who I think would be willing to take my point of view. What I would like to do is let them listen to our discussion here and see if they could perhaps summarize the or pinpoint the real point of disagreement, because I think we've
Hmm.
been turning around in circles around the real point of disagreement. I think when you
Yeah.
said it's the illusionist aspect that's doing the work, I don't think that's true.
Hmm.
Uh, I think there really is a metaphysical difference between your view and my view, which, in my view, is analogous to the vital spirit or the ether hypothesis. You know, where one really has
Interesting.
to completely abandon a particular view about what experience is in order to adopt my view. But as soon as you adopt the view, you immediately see the scientific advantage.
Hmm.
So I think it'd be worth something getting a professional philosopher
Yeah.
to
Point,
analyze our discussion here and see
send
if
them
they
my way.
can.
I'd be happy to have them on, and we can even have a group discussion if you want to come on with them. And or I
Oh
could
yeah,
just talk to them or whatever. But yeah, I'm open to having more discussions.
yeah,
Um, a part of what I have this channel and what I do, what I'm doing here is because I want to expose myself to all the different views on consciousness and think about it from all these different perspectives. So even though I was asking some questions, doesn't mean that I don't think there's something valuable or worthwhile in the way that you're approaching these issues. So I quite the opposite. I think it is valuable and very interesting. So
see,
on
I
that
mean,
note,
just one more point. I
yeah.
think, like, take the question of the what Chalmers calls the meta hard problem. Okay,
Mhm.
now I think what I did in the Frontiers article about what it's like really is productive first steps towards solving the meta hard problem. Okay, and I'm surprised that nobody seems to realize this.
Okay, so I'll be sure to put a link to that paper. But yeah, the meta hard problem, of course, is explaining why we think the things or say the things that we do about consciousness, and that's of
Yeah,
course an important thing that we want to explain, which is what you've been saying basically is a large part of your project.
yeah.
Yeah,
Very good. Okay. Well, thanks very much. And again, thanks for your patience.
well, my
I'm sorry not
pleasure.
to really, I'm sorry not to really understood. I really can't understand. I've got myself into a kind of point of view about things which make it impossible for me to understand certain things that that people like you say. It's just I've kind of turned into some kind of alien.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you have an entrenched theory on both sides, sometimes it's hard for me to understand, but that's why I like having these kinds of conversations because it does help you try to bust out and see things from a different point of view. Um, so I think you did a good job. Gave me a lot to think about. But all right, hang out for just a second. I'll say bye off.